Hello everyone. This lecture on estuaries is being recorded Saturday morning, March 14th, 2020. So, what's an estuary? An estuary is a semi-enclosed body of water where fresh water mixes with seawater. So there's a blend of conditions in the estuary from freshwater conditions to marine saltwater conditions. And that leads to a spatial gradient in many factors, most notably salinity, which is represented by the rainbow gradient that I've applied here. Salinity doesn't actually have a color, but I'm using the rainbow color to indicate going from freshwater conditions in blue to full-strength ocean salinity conditions in red. And you can see that an estuary is a zone of in-between conditions, indicated by, let me get my little tool here to mark, indicated by the stars in the estuary. You can have lots of ups and downs in salinity. So one of the things that can cause ups and downs in salinity is the movement of the tides. When the tide's coming in, it gets saltier, particularly near the mouth of the estuary. When the tide's going out, fresh water moves further towards the ocean and it gets fresher. Another thing that can affect the variability of salinity in the estuary is the river flow. So river flow can be really high in the wet season or during a rainstorm. Here in Florida we have a wet season in the summertime, so estuaries tend to get fresher in the summertime, whereas in a drought you would have the less freshwater input and the estuary would get saltier. So these changes are reflected in different levels of salinity variability in different parts of the estuary. So if you are in the head of the estuary, which is where the river first comes into the estuary, it's mostly fresh most of the time. Whereas if you're near the ocean at the mouth of the estuary, it's so heavily influenced by ocean water that it's mostly salty most of the time. And it's in that middle part of the estuary that you get the biggest ups and downs in estuarine salinity over time, and therefore the middle part of the estuary tends to be the most harsh part of the estuary for organisms to deal with, because they have to deal with both extremes of salinity if they are in the middle of the estuary. So not too many organisms can handle both extremes of salinity. So I mentioned that estuaries are semi-enclosed bodies of water where there's a mix of fresh and salt water. But there are many different kinds of geological process that can create a semi-enclosed body of water. And we classify estuaries based on what sort of geological landforms created the semi-enclosed body of water. So there's four classic categorizations: a drowned river mouth or drowned river valley estuary, a fjord estuary, which is a glacier valley that has filled up with ocean water. There's a bar-built estuary built by sandbars, and there's a tectonic estuary where rifts in the land along the coastline fill with water. So we'll give some examples of each of these kinds. First, the coastal plain or drowned river valley estuary. These estuaries form as sea level rises and floods into the valleys that were carved by the erosional forces of river flow across the landscape. So rivers carve valleys across the landscape, and the valleys tend to have branching, snaking forms just due to the natural erosional processes. And all those networks of low-lying areas in the land are revealed when sea level rises and floods into those areas. The morphology of these drowned river valley estuaries is similar to the morphology of lakes created when a river is dammed. They tend to be really branching and fingering with a tree-like morphology. So this satellite photo of Chesapeake Bay in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia shows the branches of the main stem of Chesapeake Bay, which was sort of the main river, and then all these other rivers branch off of it. This one here is the York River, where I went to graduate school at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So there's sort of like a main Drowned River Valley estuary, but there's also all these little sub-estuaries that come off of it where there's other Drowned River valleys, and it's quite a complex and wonderful estuarine system there. This is Delaware Bay, which is also a Drowned River Valley estuary. Okay, so the other type of valley in the land that fills up with water when sea level rises and becomes an estuary is a flooded glacial valley, which they call a fjord because the J in the Scandinavian languages has a Y sound. So fjords similar in a lot of ways to the Drowned River Valley estuary, but they tend to have steeper sides. So you can see how steep the sides of the estuary are here because a river of ice, a glacier, tends to carve a steep U-shaped valley. So this estuary is very deep at the bottom too, and you can see that there's this cruise ship in here. You wouldn't be able to get a cruise ship into a typical estuary in South Florida without scraping the bottom, but in these glacier carved estuaries that are so deep, you can get a cruise ship in there. There are some consequences for estuarine circulation and estuarine biogeochemistry from having such deep water in the estuary, and we'll talk about those consequences later when we talk about the characteristics of different estuaries. So that's a fjord estuary. Okay, so my favorite fjord estuary is the glacier-carved estuary in Washington State, in the northwestern corner of the most northwestern state in the continental United States. Washington State, where I grew up in Olympia, Washington, here at the bottom of Puget Sound. In this picture here, you see a ferry boat crossing the estuary from Seattle to the island across from Seattle. In the background, you see a snow-capped volcano, which is Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is a beautiful feature of Washington State that you should visit when you visit Washington State. So this estuary connects to the Pacific Ocean through Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then it branches through all these other deep rocky lined channels here. So in contrast with some East Coast estuaries, which are muddy and shallow, this is sort of a deep rocky walled estuary that has pretty high salinity. And there's actually good scuba diving in the Puget Sound estuary with all these sort of steep-sided areas to explore and relatively high salinity conditions, so you have a pretty high diversity of marine organisms there. The only thing is that the water is quite cold. So you can go and watch some of these videos of diving in Puget Sound if you want to be inspired by the beauty of a strange and different marine environment from the one you're familiar with here in Florida. Okay, so now we're getting into some estuaries that may be more familiar to our students here in Florida and people who grew up on the East Coast, and those are the bar-built estuaries. Bar-built estuaries are built by sandbars, and these estuaries tend to form in areas where the coastline has a gradual slope and there is a lot of soft sediment on the coast and on the continental shelf, so sand and mud that can be sculpted into these sandbars that enclose shallow bays. So some examples that we have in the United States are the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the Indian River Lagoon along the east coast of Florida, and the Laguna Madre in Texas and Mexico. So I'll mention each of these estuaries at some point in the lecture, I believe. All right, so this is the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Banks is sort of another word for the sandbars or sandbanks that make this string of islands that are quite far off of the main inner coast of North Carolina. So you can see that this whole area here is an estuary. It's this shallow enclosed body of water where it's sort of protected from the main Atlantic Ocean by these sandbars. And there's a few inlets in the sandbars where there's some exchange with of the fresher estuarine waters with the ocean, and those are really dynamic areas. This satellite photo was taken after a hurricane which rained a bunch on the land, so you can see these muddy fresh waters mixing into the estuary and then sort of moving out into the ocean through these estuarine plumes out into the ocean. And it wouldn't always be such an extreme color contrast between the estuary water and the open ocean water, but this is just a good visual for that mixing of fresh and ocean waters. Another thing to note here, let me see if I can clear the, let's see, erase all ink on slide. Great. So another thing to note about this estuary is that this estuary is formed not just by the sandbars, but you can also see that there's a drowned river valley estuary, or two or three, kind of in the backwaters of the estuary. So like many estuaries, this is not strictly built by one geological force, but it's sort of like a combination of multiple types of estuary. So this is both a bar-built estuary and a drowned river valley estuary, and that sort of mixed modes of formation. All right, the final kind of estuary to discuss is the tectonic estuary. That's where the main land sculpting forces that created the low-lying area were geological uplift and subsidence. And we see that in Central California, where there's a very active continental margin there, and there are rifts in the land indicated by the faint red lines on this PowerPoint, and those have created this low-lying area that's been flooded by Pacific Ocean water, and this is the San Francisco Bay estuary. The Golden Gate Bridge is right here between Oakland and San Francisco, that famous gigantic bridge. And then if you go further up the estuary where the this major river system comes in, you have a drowned river valley estuary in this upper portion of the estuary. So again, this is another estuary that's a hybrid between one type, the tectonic estuary, and then the drowned river valley estuary is part of the morphology here as well. Okay, so one thing that all estuaries have in common, regardless of what geological forces sculpted the land there, is that the estuaries that we know today have not been around in their current form for very long. They're all younger than the last ice age because sea level was so much lower during the last ice age. The peak of the last ice age, it was 120 or 130 meters lower, and that was only 15 to 20,000 years ago. That although there were estuaries at that time, they were in areas that are deep underwater now and nowhere near where the modern day coastline is. And so the sea level rose and totally resculpted all the coastal estuarine features, and it wasn't until we got into where sea level was just a couple meters away from its present level that estuaries that approximate their modern forms would have been found. So the coastlines and estuarine shapes that we know today, like Chesapeake Bay and the Outer Banks and all those kind of things, would have been unrecognizable more than 5,000 years ago or so. But sea level rise has been slow for the last 5,000 years, and so that's why the estuaries have sort of been relatively stable for that time, although they are still changing. This is just to emphasize sort of where the coastline was at the peak of the last ice age. So particularly here off the coast of southwest Florida, where we are now and where the estuaries are now would have been high and dry during the last ice age, and there would have been estuaries along the coast which are now deep underwater and sort of erased by the ravages of time. So even though things are not changing as rapidly or haven't been changing as rapidly in the last 5,000 years or so as they were during the big melt pulse at the end of the last ice age, there are still some ongoing changes in estuaries. There are areas where the land is settling due to subsidence of sediments, and there's sort of a balance between how much mud and sand is being deposited into estuaries, which raises the land level, and how much that those sediments are settling, which lowers the land level relative to the sea level. There's also this phenomenon called isostatic rebound, which is sort of like if there's a glacier sitting on the land, this is a glacier, I know it doesn't necessarily look like a glacier, but if there's a glacier sitting on the land, it weighs the land down in that area and mounds the land up in another area. And when the glacier melts, um, so glacier melted, then things settle back down back to flat, and so this land is sort of rebounding back to flat um, as the pressure from the glacier pushing down goes away. And so the relative land level relative to the sea level is lowering in those areas, and so the ocean can be flooding in and covering areas that were once pushed up higher. And that's what's happening in the Chesapeake Bay area, and so that estuary is kind of expanding and flooding out island communities where there used to be a bunch of fishermen houses and things like that. So this isostatic rebound is happening at the same time as global sea level rise is increasing again due to climate change. So the combination of this land settling or isostatic rebound and the global sea level rise that you all have probably learned about in the news and talk about global warming and stuff, it's all kind of combining together and creating pretty rapid and destructive sea level rise along the shorelines of many estuaries. And then the only other issue I wanted to emphasize was the erosion deposition issue. So estuaries are really dynamic environments where a lot of sediments are being brought in by the rivers, and those can pile up and be secured and stabilized by marshes and mangroves, and oyster reefs can build up the land as well. So you've got these various processes that are sort of building up the land and maybe advancing the coastline, but at the same time you've got erosion and sea level rise, which are wearing away the coastline, and there's an interesting sort of race between the processes that are building up the coastline and building up the seabed and the ones that are destroying it. And so many scientists who study estuaries are focused on these geological processes because they have big implications for human use of estuaries as well as for the natural environment. All right, so the two big fundamentals of estuarine ecology that I would like to discuss now that we've covered the estuarine morphology, geology stuff, are that estuaries have high biomass and productivity. They're very productive environments, both in terms of primary productivity and secondary productivity. But especially compared to coral reefs and other stable high salinity environments, estuaries have rather low diversity. So highly productive for the species that can survive there, but not too many different kinds of species, at least not relative to other more speciose, biodiverse marine environments. So why might that be? Well, we'll talk about some of the reasons in more detail, but the general idea is the harshness and variability is what limits the diversity. So it's a harsh and variable environment, and that limits the diversity. Variability. And so that is why you have not that many different species. But why do you have such high productivity? The reason that you can have high productivity despite not having that many different species is lots of nutrients and organic matter. So there's lots of nutrients for the plant life and lots of organic matter for the heterotroph to eat. All right. I don't know about this writing manually on the voiceover. It might take too much time. I'll evaluate that later. Okay, so all right, well, let's talk more about sort of the conditions, environmental conditions in the estuary and how those influence the life there. So we mentioned that there is a blend of fresh and salt water in the estuary. So this, where the fresh water comes in is called the head of the estuary, and then where the estuary meets the ocean is called the mouth of the estuary. And so there's a horizontal gradient in salinity from the head to the mouth of the estuary of increasing salinity. So that's the horizontal gradient. And then there's the vertical gradient in salinity, which is one that I haven't talked about before, but that's like as you go from the surface to the bottom, there tends to be increasing salinity in the estuary, and that's due to the greater density of the salty marine waters normally compared to the fresh river waters. And so it's not just a smooth blend all the time as you go from the head to the mouth of the estuary, but the fresh waters from the river will kind of float on top of the saltier waters below, which form what we call a salt wedge. And so there's actually kind of a movement of water. Let me clear my marks here. There's actually kind of a movement of water associated with this layering, because the tendency for the fresh water to spread across the surface due to its lower density and the salt water to fill in along the bottom due to its greater density leads to this overall bidirectional flow. So you have sort of this net movement of fresh surface water out to the estuary and net movement of deeper salty water into the estuary. Although there are certainly other currents that affect flow in the estuary as well, like the incoming and outgoing tide. But if you kind of cut through the noise of those daily ins and outs of tide, you have this underlying pattern of surface flow out of the estuary and bottom flow into the estuary. And this is a diagram from a textbook that shows that same thing. You've got these different salinity levels indicating the transition from fresh to marine conditions, and then you've got this salt wedge associated with movement along the bottom into the estuary. And there's sort of at the interface between the incoming salt water and the outgoing fresh water, there's an interesting mixing zone, and that's kind of what allows their what keeps the water in balance is that the salt water doesn't make it all the way up the river because it gradually mixes with the surface water and is carried out to sea. All right, so some organisms in the estuary actually take advantage of the estuarine circulation to help them in their life cycles. This organism here is a blue crab, Calanectes sapidus, and this is a female. The females have red-tipped claws like this. And so blue crabs, when they're adults, they like to hang out in the upper parts of the estuary where it's low salinity. They might even live in fresh water. And they need to release their young out on the continental shelf waters because due to the salinity preferences and the plankton dietary needs of the young, the young develop best out here in the continental shelf waters. So the adult blue crab, when she's laden with eggs, needs to migrate this way. And the most energy efficient way that she can migrate is along the surface. So she doesn't have to swim all this horizontal distance herself. She just kind of swims up to the surface and then drifts all the way out to the continental shelf where she can release her eggs, and then she'll go back down to the bottom and ride the currents back up. The young blue crabs, once they've reached the larval stage where they're ready to come back into the estuary, they'll also do the same thing. So they're very weak swimmers. They wouldn't be able to just swim straight into the estuary themselves, but they'll swim a little bit down to the bottom, and then they'll sort of ride that circulation into the estuary until they find some environment in the estuary that suits them to settle. And particularly they like habitats where there's some structure, like some seagrass that they can live on. And then through the rest of their life, they'll continue to move further up into the estuary. So the general trend is that the older adult crabs are moving more up into fresh water. So pretty interesting how through the life cycle of this blue crab, they exploit the sort of conveyor belt that's the bidirectional conveyor belt of the estuarine circulation. All right, so not all estuaries have that classic diagonal wedge pattern of salinity. Some estuaries are pretty well mixed by strong tidal mixing, or if they're in areas where there's a lot of wind mixing that sort of breaks down the vertical stratification. So in a well-mixed estuary, there's little vertical stratification. So you don't see a difference in salinity between the surface and the bottom. You only see the salinity difference from the mouth to the head of the estuary. So No difference between the top and the bottom, but there is a difference from where the river comes into the ocean. So in a well-mixed estuary, and really in any estuary, there tends to be a zone in the middle estuary, sometimes the upper middle part of the estuary, um, where there's a lot of turbidity, where the water is very murky and muddy. And that's because it's sort of in between the area where there's a lot of influence by river flow and the area where there's a lot of influence by these bidirectional tidal currents. And so the currents where they're stronger near the river and stronger near the inlet to the ocean tend to sort of whisk away fine-grained sediments and scour the fine mud away from the water, whereas everything kind of meets and collides and just ends up being this really muddy area where all the sediments settle out and then get stirred back up, and it's just sort of a disaster of muddiness where a lot of organisms have a hard time surviving because there's so much mud mixed in with the water that, like, filter feeders can't filter efficiently, predators can't find their prey because the water's so murky, although there are some organisms, particularly as larvae, that will actually seek out the estuarine turbidity maximum because it's kind of like a hiding place from their predators. So just be aware that somewhere in the middle of the estuary, because of the sort of interface between the river-influenced area and the ocean-influenced area, there's sort of this no man's land called the estuarine turbidity maximum, which is sometimes abbreviated ETM. All right, so we sort of talked about an extreme version of the estuary where it's very well mixed and no difference in salinity between the surface and the bottom. But now here's the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's a very stratified estuary where there's a very strong difference in salinity between the surface and the bottom. And you tend to find this in deep estuaries, estuaries where there's weak tidal currents and weak winds, so weak winds and tides would tend to lead to this high salinity stratification. Another factor that might lead to high salinity stratification would be if there's warming of the surface waters, which would lead to thermal stratification, which would make things even more stratified than just with the salinity differences. So one of the types of estuaries that tends to get really stratified like this is a fjord estuary because they are so deep due to the big glacier valley. Another thing that fjord estuaries tend to have is a shallow spot near the mouth of the estuary called a sill. That's because when the glacier bulldozed over the land, it piled up a big mound of rock and gravel and mud at its terminus, where it sort of the farthest extent that that river of ice reached, and it might be deeper behind that. So this kind of isolates this deep water of the estuary from the ocean and the surface, and that means that the deep waters of a fjord, because they're kind of isolated and cut off from the surface water and open ocean waters, tend to have problems with low dissolved oxygen. So one cool example of a fjord estuary that has problems with low dissolved oxygen at the bottom is Nitnat Lake in British Columbia. They call it Nitnat Lake, but it's really an estuary, and this is its opening to the Pacific Ocean. You can see how narrow the opening is here, even though this estuary is quite big. This opening is also very shallow, even though the estuary further back here is quite deep. So you have this very limited exchange with the ocean, and yet there's this reservoir of deep water beneath where it tends to be salty and anoxic. The estuary also, because it connects the cool Pacific to the warmer interior of Vancouver Island, British Columbia, tends to be a natural wind tunnel, which is popular with windsurfers and kiteboarders here. So that's why you see all these kites flying and sports people doing their thing here. So one of the consequences of the fact that this estuary is salty and anoxic on the bottom and just the surface water layers are sort of lower salinity and habitable to fish and stuff is that if there's ever any disruption in the layering, sometimes the low dissolved oxygen waters can be brought to the surface, and that can cause fish kills that are a threat to the salmon hatcheries and other natural fish populations along this estuary. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is mud. So when we think of estuaries, we think of muddy, gross waters. So mud is not just made up of small mineral grains like little pieces of rock and sand and clay. It's also made up of little bits of organic matter, particulate organic matter, which we often abbreviate POM. And so there are many different sources of that organic matter. Some of the sources are from outside the estuary, and we call those allochthonous sources. Allochthonous means from outside. So some of those can come from the land. So that would be like sticks and leaves swept down the river and broken up into small bits. Those end up on the bottom of the estuary. And then also things of marine origin. So these little phytoplankton here could have been phytoplankton that grew in the ocean and then were brought into the estuary by the tides and then died and fell to the bottom and became particulate organic matter in the muds of the estuary. But there's also autochthonous organic matter. So that means that its primary production that happened in the estuary itself and then it ended up on the bottom. So some phytoplankton can grow in the estuary itself. We call those estuarine phytoplankton. Benthic microalgae are algae that live on the bottom of at the surface of the mud, and those grow in an estuary. And then marshes, mangroves, and seagrass. These are all sort of types of plants that grow in and on the borders of estuaries, and they would be part of the autochthonous organic matter. So it's organic matter that's produced in the estuary and stays in the estuary. So basically there's tons of organic matter enriching the mud of estuaries for better or worse. Another word for this particulate organic matter is detritus. So the fact that there's all this detritus, all of this organic material in estuaries, means that there's potentially a lot of food for things that eat detritus or make their living by decomposing detritus. So a lot of invertebrates eat detritus, worms in the sediment, for example, and there are a lot of microbes like fungi and bacteria that break down detritus, and then subsequently they themselves enter the food chain as they're eaten by other things. So you can have a lot of secondary production as that's supported by all of this detritus. And you can actually have an estuary be net heterotrophic, meaning that there's more organic matter being broken down, respired, than is actually being created within the estuary. How is that? It's because not all of the organic matter in an estuary was actually produced in the estuary because of the allochthonous productions. That means that all of the organic matter being swept down from the land or brought in from the oceans is also being decomposed in the estuary. So if you have more respiration than photosynthetic primary production, as you all know from our earlier lectures, you can be consuming more oxygen than you're creating. So all of this decomposing organic matter can lead to low oxygen problems. So estuaries are highly susceptible to low oxygen problems, particularly in the deeper parts of the estuary where the waters may be cut off from oxygen mixing in from the surface. Okay, so this image shows some sewage pipes dumping into an estuary, and this is to illustrate the fact that when there's an excessive amount of organic matter being delivered to an estuary with these man-made inputs of organic matter on top of the natural allochthonous and autochthonous sources of organic matter, you can really overload the estuary with too much organic matter to be uh, and you get such intensive decomposition that it really depletes oxygen levels. So this idea of low oxygen resulting from the decomposition of organic matters is a big thing in estuarine ecology, and where the water column of the estuary will become depleted in oxygen, where there's an extreme amount of organic matter decomposition. It's actually normal for the sediments of the estuary to be depleted in oxygen as you go deeper in the sediments. So just because sediments restrict the movement of and diffusion of oxygen in and out of the water, you tend to have like a decreasing amount of oxygen the deeper you go down in the sediments. So there's actually sort of a pattern that you can see if you take like a shovel full of sediment and look at it from the surface to the bottom, where the sediments will be sort of more of a brown or light gray color near the surface and black deep down. And that's because mineral compounds are oxidized in the surface, leading to these lighter colors, and minerals are reduced because of the low oxygen environment deeper down, so they look black in color. And so it's not just color that changes, there's different chemistry happening in these different layers of mud. So in the layers with oxygen, there's aerobic decomposition happening. So it means that the microbes that break down organic matter in these surface layers, since they have oxygen, they use oxygen in their respiration, because oxygen is sort of like the most efficient kind of electron acceptor in the reactions of respiration. So the oxygen is preferentially used up because that gives the most energy yield for, if you're going to break down a certain amount of organic matter, you want to get the maximum energy from that you can, and if you've got oxygen, that's how you get the maximum energy from that breakdown process. But you get to a zone where the oxygen has been depleted, and there you have to turn to other substitutes for oxygen as the electron acceptor in the reaction. And one of the best substitutes that microbes can use is nitrate, and so they'll reduce the nitrate to more reduced forms of nitrate, ultimately to nitrogen gas, which in a way is pretty important in the nitrogen cycle, because it takes these nutrient forms of nitrogen out of the system and turns them back into nitrogen gas. And that's called dissimilatory nitrate reduction. So that can happen. Oxidized forms of iron can be reduced in iron reduction. That doesn't have quite as high an energy yield, but it does happen. And then sulfate, this oxidized form of sulfur, can be reduced to hydrogen sulfide. If you've ever been to an estuary at low tide and smelled kind of a bad rotten eggs or flatulence kind of smell, that was the hydrogen sulfide bubbling out of the sediment after sulfate had been reduced by this form of anaerobic respiration. And then finally, sort of the electron acceptor of last resort is carbon dioxide, which is reduced to methane in methanogenesis. So this happens when there's no other electron acceptors available in the most anoxic zones of the sediment. All right. So the layering of oxygenated versus anoxic sediment is not always a smooth layering. It's kind of mixed up a little bit by physical and biological processes. And one of the biological processes that can sort of mix oxygen further down into the sediment is called bioturbation. So turbation means mixing up, and bio means living things. So living things like worms or crustaceans that are in the sediment can sort of bioturbate the sediment and introduce oxygen further down. So here we see some oxygenated layers of sediment, indicated by their lighter color, have been brought down deeper by the action of, I'm not quite sure what organisms they are in this sediment profile image, but something has mixed oxygen further down in here, and that can sort of have a positive effect on the other life that's in the sediment as well, because most invertebrates that live in the sediment need to have oxygen to survive. This type of image is taken with what they call a sediment profile camera, which is a sort of a wedge-shaped device that's dropped into the sediment. It's a wedge that has a glass wall on one side, and it's got a camera on the inside. So here's a little camera, and they drop it into the sediment, and so you can take a picture of whatever's happening in the sediment here, and then this thing's like on a pole or some sort that they plunge down from a boat, or dangle on a chain down from the surface to take a picture of the sediment. So that's the kind of device that was used to take this picture, just so you know. All right, so folks who've studied the life that is in sediments and in relation to different levels of organic matter and oxygen in the estuary have described this pattern of sort of decreasing abundance and diversity of life as you go from well-oxygenated sediments with a moderate supply of organic matter to really anoxic sediments where they're just so overloaded with organic matter and so much decomposition is happening that the no oxygen layer reaches all the way to the surface. So this, like, there's no oxygen, no O2 whatsoever in these sediments here all the way to the surface, and there's probably not even any oxygen in the waters at the surface in this really excessively enriched area where you see this mat of anaerobic bacteria on the surface of the sediment. Whereas at the healthy end of the spectrum, you've got these large-bodied, complex infaunal organisms that are flourishing in this relatively thick layer of oxygenated sediments. And then, as you get into more and more degraded conditions where there's a greater excess of organic matter, the habitable layer of sediment for infauna is smaller and smaller, and you have sort of a lower diversity of organisms because only things like these oligocete worms, a type of oligocete worms, they're one of the organisms that's really tolerant of low oxygen conditions and might be some of the last things that you'd see still alive in sediment that's of poor quality. So this red line here is what they're calling the oxycline. That's like the zone in the sediment where you go from oxygenated to anoxic. And the shoaling of the oxycline means the low oxygen layer is creeping up, closer and closer to the surface till it's all the way to the surface. And so if you were going from like an unpolluted area to a polluted area, you'd see this pattern. All right, so the thing about organic matter is that it's a huge category. Organic matter includes everything from hair to wood to fat to meat to fish slime to jellyfish slime to diatoms. There's so many different kinds of organic matter that it's sort of misleading if we say, oh yeah, just organic matter, because it's not all the same. And so these are some of the ways that organic matter varies. It varies in whether it's alive or dead, so I'm calling that deadness. So all organic matter came from something that was living at one point, and it may still be alive, like I am organic matter. But dead things like a piece of wood is also organic matter, and it's not alive anymore, but it was once alive. Another thing that can vary is the size of the organic matter. So you can go from big chunks to tiny chunks to things that are no longer even solid particles. They're just dissolved molecules, dissolved organic matter mixed in with water. They might even be invisible, although there are some types of dissolved organic matter that discolor the water, and we call those colored dissolved organic matter. So actually most of the organic matter in the ocean is dissolved organic matter. So even though it's largely invisible, if you counted up all the atoms, most of it would be in this dissolved form. Okay, so yeah, big multicellular organisms for chunks of the remain, small microorganisms, fine particles of detritus. Okay, and then this really important third factor to consider for organic matter is lability. So labile organic matter means it's types of organic compounds that are easily consumed or decomposed. So like fats and sugars are easily consumed and decomposed by microbes and animals and fungi, whereas there's some types of organic matter that are refractory. They're resistant to decomposition. So like wood is not easily eaten by most organisms, and then some smaller molecules like tannins are also not decomposed well, not even by the hardiest bacteria. So no organic matter is completely refractory. Anything can decompose given a long enough time and the right conditions, but it's sort of a spectrum from easily decomposed labile things to refractory things that stick around for a long time. So as you might imagine, the things that are more refractory tend to last longer, so there's sort of like a buildup of refractory organic matter in a lot of estuarine systems. So one of the types of refractory organic matter is colored dissolved organic matter, CDOM. So tannins are one of the components of CDOM, and so sometimes CDOM and tannins are used synonymously. So CDOM absorbs a lot of short wavelength light, like blue light, and because it's reflecting the longer wavelengths of light, like red, it gives the water sort of a reddish orange look, sort of like tea. And because blue light is one of the wavelengths of light that's most needed by photosynthetic primary producers, water where the blue light's being blocked by a high concentration of colored dissolved organic matter, it'll be really hard for plants like seagrass to grow at the bottom of that water because they're not getting enough light of the right wavelengths to grow. So it's a big consequence in estuaries. So the processes that create and break down CDOM are quite complex and are illustrated in this infographic here. So you can see that there are a lot of terrestrial sources of colored dissolved organic matter from decomposing plant matter in soils and such. There's also some marine sources from decomposing sediments and seagrass material. And then there are some things that break down the organic matter. So strong sunlight, illustrated by this white arrow here, tends to bust up or photo bleach the dissolved organic matter, and so that can turn these refractory compounds into compounds that are more easily broken down and consumed by bacteria and such. Also, there's an interesting sort of symbiosis between benthic invertebrates and bacteria that can help break down CDOM. So the benthic invertebrates don't usually eat CDOM directly, but as they filter water, they bring in a lot of CDOM, and they have bacteria that live symbiotically within their tissues, and the bacteria can turn that dissolved organic matter into particulate organic matter that can be digested by the sessile invertebrates like the sea squirts or the sponges. And so the net effect is that it's as if they are filtering out the CDOM, even though it's really the bacteria that are embedded within them that are actually getting rid of the CDOM. But overall, this sort of combination of photobleaching and microbial action and the microbial filter feeder symbioses will eventually eliminate the CDOM from these coastal sources. So by the time you get to the more offshore waters where you might have reefs or clear water pelagic systems, there's much lower concentration of CDOM, and it's important that we have these things that are reducing the CDOM to enable the clear water dependent organisms to survive. This is a picture of a mangrove from beneath, where you can see many sea squirts and sponges covering the prop roots of this mangrove. And this is one of the sort of stages in the movement of water from estuaries out to further out on the continental shelf, where the CDOM can be intercepted and reduced by these microbial infested filter feeder communities attached to the mangrove roots. So it's kind of interesting. The mangrove swamps can be sources of colored dissolved organic matter through their decomposing leaves and twigs, but some of the organisms that live on the mangrove roots can also be taking up the CDOM. All right, so we're going to talk about two weird estuaries, the Baltic Sea and Laguna Madre, because these exceptionally strange estuaries will help give us some insight into the ecosystem properties of estuaries in general. So we'll start with the Baltic Sea. Baltic Sea is the biggest estuary in the world as far as I'm aware. It's in northern Europe between the countries of Scandinavia and northern Europe. I think Denmark is sometimes considered Scandinavia, although it's connected to the landmass of northern Europe. So the input of salt water to the estuary is from the North Atlantic Ocean here through the Skagerrak and Kattegat, but it's relatively restricted by these narrow passageways. So there's a very slow turnover of water within the estuary, which means that it takes a really long time for the waters from the estuary to kind of mix and make their way back and forth between the ocean and the estuary. So there's sort of low salinity in the estuary, about 8 parts per thousand on average, which is only about a fourth of the salinity of the ocean. And that low salinity is relatively stable compared to most estuaries because the estuary is so large. So this is sort of a color-coded map of the average salinity of the Baltic Sea. And you can see that there's large regions of it where the salinity is about 8 parts per thousand. So this is interesting. It's because the salinities stay about the same for a long period of time, the freshwater organisms are able to kind of creep out till they're just about at the limits of how salty water they can tolerate, and the marine organisms can creep in till they're just about at the limits of how much fresh water they can tolerate. And you can actually see some weird overlap between marine species like cod and freshwater species like pike, because they're able to each kind of push the limits of how much salinity or freshwater they can tolerate, and you might even be able to catch some freshwater fish and some saltwater fish in the same places in the Baltic Sea, which is weird. So scientists have been studying the Baltic Sea for a long time because it's in northern Europe, which is an area that's been wealthy and highly developed for a long period of time. So scientists, including the German scientist named Remain, have studied what species are found in what different regions of the Baltic Sea, and Remain sort of tallied up the number of different species that he found in waters of different salinity in the Baltic Sea and created this diagram, which is now known as a Remain diagram. And what he found, moving from the low salinity freshwater end, was that there would be a lot of species in the freshwater and the very low salinity water where freshwater species could survive. So lots of species. And then if he was at the opposite end of the spectrum, at the typical marine salinities of 35 parts per thousand, there were lots of species at those ocean salinities as well, because that's, things are adapted to ocean salinities. They survive well in those salinities. But if he was sampling in the range where the salinities was a little too salty for the freshwater species to survive and a little too fresh for the saltwater species to survive, there were few species that he encountered in that region of the estuary. So he theorized that there were relatively few species that were, really true estuarine species adapted to low and in between salinity levels, whereas there were lots of purely freshwater species and lots of purely saltwater species that could just kind of partially tolerate the estuary. And there have been subsequent questions raised about, like, is this theory developed in the Baltic Sea applicable to all estuaries? And it may not apply perfectly everywhere, but as a general trend, it is still useful. There's definitely fewer species in the sort of in-between salinities of an estuary than there are at either extreme end. Something you should also notice is that at least this drawing of the diagram, it actually goes beyond full strength salt water, and you can see that if your waters get saltier than the typical salinity of the ocean, then you start to see a decrease in the number of species that can survive in those salty waters. And the next estuary we'll talk about actually experiences conditions that are sometimes saltier than typical ocean water. So that estuary is the Laguna Madre, which means Mother's Lagoon. So Laguna Madre is in Texas and Mexico. It's kind of like a complex network of bar-built estuaries along the coastline there. And this is a really, really hot, dry area of the world. So there's not a whole lot of river input to these estuaries. And evaporation sometimes exceeds freshwater inflow to the estuaries, so the estuaries can actually get saltier than the Gulf of Mexico. The estuaries, the coastline there is pretty flat, so they're like really broad, shallow estuaries, and because the salinity conditions are so high, it can sort of limit some of the coastal plants that live around the estuaries where the soils are very salty. But they do have a variety of salt marsh plants and some mangroves. You can see a little bit of mangroves in the background here. In the Laguna Madre, they have, at least in the United States part of the Laguna Madre, they have black mangroves, but they don't have red mangroves or white mangroves like we have at the same latitude in Florida. And the reason is because in the Laguna Madre, it is connected to the main continental landmass, which means that it can sometimes get cold, frosty winter weather, and that those periodic cold snaps make the area uninhabitable, at least currently, for red mangroves and white mangroves, whereas the hardier black mangroves are still able to survive. So on average, the conditions are quite hot there, but it does have some more extreme cold than Florida does, which is why you don't have the same sort of mangrove diversity in the Laguna Madre as you do in Florida. I believe this bird here is a reddish egret, so it's one of the types of wading birds that can flourish in the Laguna Madre. So one of the things that these birds are eating in the estuary is fish. So estuaries, because of their productivity of detritus-eating organisms, which then transfers up the food chain to small fishes, you have a huge food source for the birds and other things. And in the Laguna Madre, those fishes have to deal with extreme ups and downs of salinity. And it's pretty amazing that some estuarine fishes are not only able to deal with sort of the typical range of fresh to salt water, like 0 to 35 parts per thousand, but they're actually able to tolerate hypersaline conditions, like the striped mullet, a sort of plankton and detritus-eating fish that lives in the estuary, can tolerate salinity that's almost 3 times the salinity of typical ocean water. And some other small, so the mullet is the name of a fish, but it's also the name of a hairstyle. And so this is the rock musician David Bowie. Had a long career from the 1960s to the 2017, I think. So anyways, David Bowie had a mullet, but the mullet is also a fish. All right, the other thing here is that there's this super duper hardy fish, the sheepshead minnow, a little invertebrate eating fish that is important in the food chain of estuaries, and it can survive in some backwaters of the Laguna Madre where the salinity gets very high, up to 150 parts per thousand, at least for a short period of time. And that sort of allows there to be a food chain in these parts of the estuary where the salinity levels are really extreme. There can ultimately be too high salinity for any fish to survive, though. Yet there's still some invertebrates that can survive in those super duper hyper salty waters. Artemia salina is the name for a crustacean called the brine shrimp, and it's able to survive in hypersaline waters up to like 300 parts per thousand. These organisms their eggs can survive being dried out, so they can survive in ponds that seasonally dry out. And because of that, They can pack up their eggs, and you can order them by mail and sort of just add water and grow the brine shrimp. And they sell them to kids as sea monkeys, which is a little bit misleading because they're not actually monkeys, and they don't look anything like they do in this cartoon. Um, Although they are pretty wonderful organisms, so I wouldn't want to dissuade you from ordering some sea monkeys and raising your own Artemia, and you'll get to see these exotic crustaceans swimming around in a little aquarium. One of the types of organisms that eats brine shrimp in hypersaline lagoons is the flamingo. There's actually several species of flamingo throughout the world, but many of them specialize in living in and feeding in hypersaline lagoons where not that many other organisms can survive. And they have a special sort of filter feeding apparatus in their beak that lets them turn their heads upside down and filter the brine shrimp out of the water. There are other invertebrates that thrive in brine as well. The larvae of a type of fly, Chironomus salinarius, thrives in really salty sediments. And we don't really think of insects as living in salt water because for the most part salt waters are dominated by crustaceans and other arthropods, not by insects, whereas the sort of the freshwater and terrestrial environment is the domain of the insects. But chironomids are one exception. There are many species of chironomid fly that do have larvae that live in estuaries or fresh waters. And this one species, the brine fly, can be so abundant in hypersaline lagoons that clouds of it fill the air and can actually be food for gulls, like the one that's chomping through the air eating the brine flies here. Um, one one type of chironomid is a biting fly or a biting midge that they call the no-see-um because they're small and hard to see. And if anyone has sort of been to a coastal wetland area in Florida, you're familiar with the no-see-ums because they're really annoying. All right, so dealing with salinity differences in an estuary is a big physiological challenge for the organisms that live there. Differences in salinity can stress out organisms by sort of disrupting their cell salt balance, causing their cells to blow up or shrivel up, and for their biochemicals to not react properly with each other. So you can't just expect to be in water where the salinity is changing and to just be okay. You need to have some kind of adaptation to survive and be able to carry out your metabolic functions in those different conditions. But there's sort of two approaches that evolution has granted to organisms for dealing with this. So some organisms really fight to maintain a certain level of salt and water within their bodies at all times, regardless of what's going on outside them, and those are called the osmoregulators. So they fight what's going on outside them and maintain constant conditions within themselves. So this is a tuna fish and this is a blue crab, not related, but they're both osmoregulators. And then there's osmoconformers, which sort of have a similar concentration of salt and water in their bodies as whatever is happening outside of them, and they just sort of have to adapt to whatever is happening outside of them, and that system can work just fine as well, and may be a little bit less energetically costly than osmoregulation. So a lot of invertebrates are osmoconformers. A lot of algae, like this sea lettuce ulva, are osmoconformers, but there are some vertebrates, like some sharks, that are osmoconformers, meaning that they have the same osmotic pressure due to salts and other dissolved ions in their bodies as there is outside of them. Okay, so let's talk about the osmoregulators. We're not going to talk about the osmoconformers anymore. So osmoregulation means you're trying to maintain some concentration of salt and water in your body that's different from the concentration that's outside of you. But there's two possible situations that you'd have to deal with as an osmoconformer. You could have to, and so we'll talk about those both. The first type of situation that we'll talk about is being hyperosmotic with respect to the water around you. So that means that you are saltier than the water. You've got more salt in your body fluids, like your blood and your intracellular fluids, than there is in the water around you. And then, so due to the process of osmosis, water is tending to flow from the water surrounding you into your cells. And so there's a tendency for you to be sort of swelling up, for your cells to be bloating and expanding. And so you need to constantly be dumping the excess water from yourself, and yet trying to not lose the salts that you have concentrated in your body. So you have to pee all the time, urinate all the time, or somehow otherwise excrete the fresh water from your body without excreting the dissolved ions like sodium, potassium, and chloride ions. So you can see that there's a lot of urine being produced by this freshwater fish, which is saltier than the surrounding water, but the urine is very dilute, meaning that it's not losing any ions in the urine because the urine is mostly just pure water. Okay, so the next situation is if you're hypoosmotic, meaning that the water surrounding you is saltier than the fluids within your cellular tissues and fluids. And so that means that the water tends to be getting sucked out of you. The osmotic pressure means that the water tends to want to leave your body and mix into the saltier waters around you, sort of like a dry sponge would wick away water from a wet spill. The salty water wants to wick water out of your less salty body tissues. And so the tendency would be for you to shrivel up like a raisin. And so in order to avoid that happening, these saltwater fishes and other organisms that have a low internal concentration of salt relative to the surrounding fluid need to drink a lot of water to replace the fluids. The only problem is that as they're drinking a lot of water, they're also getting a lot of salt in with that. So they need to get rid of a lot of salt even as they're drinking a lot of water. So one of the ways they do that is by actively pumping salt ions out of the out through their gills. So they have special membranes in their gill rakers which are able to pump excess salt ions like this out of their bodies. Also, their excretory system, their kidneys and all that, they can make very salty urine so that when they pee, it's very salty, and they're not getting rid of much water when they pee because they want to hang on to the water, but they're getting rid of a lot of salt when they pee. Okay, so there are many organisms that can do one or the other, that can deal with living in salty water, that can deal with living in fresh water. And those are what we call stenohaline species. So they're able to, steno means like narrow. So stenohaline means you can deal with a narrow range of salinity conditions. So you're really good at dealing with living in salty water, or you're really good at dealing with living in fresh water, but you wouldn't be able to be versatile, like you couldn't switch between living in fresh water or living in salt water. And then there's what we call euryhaline species. Eury means sort of like good or capable. So euryhaline species can handle whatever salinity you throw at them, at least up to a point. So those could switch around their osmoregulation style in order to move between fresh water and salt water, or to deal with a change in salinity at the location that they're at. So I'm calling the stenohaline species the osmoregulation specialists because they can handle the conditions that they're adapted for, but they can't handle other conditions. And then the osmoregulation masters are the euryhaline species that are able to handle sort of, any sort of conditions. The caveat, though, is that these euryhaline species, although they might be able to deal with almost any salinity as adults, they could be more sensitive when they're babies or juveniles, or they might have different salinity needs when they're babies or juveniles. And so we call shifts in organisms' sort of behavior or habitat or physiology that happen as they mature ontogenetic shifts. So there can be ontogenetic shifts in the salinity tolerance and environmental needs of estuarine species, and we'll talk about that coming up. All right, so some species that undergo ontogenetic habitat shifts are species that are born in fresh or brackish water, but then have their adulthood in salt water. So that would be an ontogenetic shift from freshwater or brackish habitat as babies to an adult habitat in salt water. I do have this, there's an exception to the rule here sometimes. Some species can be landlocked, like if they're in a lake and river system that doesn't have access to the ocean because of dams or natural barriers, then maybe instead of going to saltwater as adults, they'll just stay in the lake as adults. And so an example of that would be the species of Pacific salmon that have been introduced to the Great Lakes, and now they just treat the Great Lake as their ocean and don't ever actually go to the salt water in any stage in their life cycle. Okay, so salmonids include fish like salmon and trout. Shad is a relative of the herring that's found on the east coast of the United States, and they move between freshwater as babies and saltwater as adults. Striped bass can do that. Many species of sturgeon, which is this primitive group of fish you see an example of here. River smelt, a type of small bait fish. Lamprey, a very primitive jawless fish. So there's a large number of fishes that are anadromous, that are born in fresh or brackish water and move into salt water, or at least can move into salt water as adults. So why would you go to all that trouble, and why not just stay where you were born or be born in the place where you're going to be an adult? So what are the advantages? Well, one of the reasons that things do this is the fact that what might be an ideal habitat for an adult could be a really difficult habitat for babies. Maybe there's a lot of predators in the ocean, so you wouldn't want to be born in the ocean. Likewise, habitat that's maybe very good for babies could be bad for adults. Like for baby salmon, there's lots of good food sources in a small stream, but for an adult salmon, they would need to be in the ocean to have the abundant enough food sources to grow rapidly into a large size. So migrating helps them sort of get the resources that they need at that stage in their life. So we can sort of see that in this life cycle of the salmon. So the species of salmon shown here is the sockeye salmon. They look really distinctive when they're in their breeding colors, which happens actually right before they die, because they breed once and then die. These species that breed once and then die are called semelparous, whereas if they bred multiple times without dying, they would be called iteroparous, meaning that they can breed more than once. But the Pacific salmon are semelparous. They breed once and then die. Anyways, when they breed, they lay a bunch of little orange eggs down in the well-oxygenated gravel sediments of fast-flowing streams. Those eggs hatch into little larvae which first feed off of their yolk sac and then feed on small plankton in the freshwater stream environment. But as the young fish get larger, they need to seek different food sources, and they move down the river into the estuary. In the estuary, they may stay for a while and feed on small invertebrates and seagrass beds. So I'm drawing some seagrass in the estuary here. But eventually they sort of outgrow that habitat as well and move out to the open ocean, where they can feed on abundant schooling bait fishes in the open ocean. And rapidly, in just 2 to 4 years, they reach these large sizes, and these majestic silvery fish are then compelled by instinct to move back into the estuary, although it's a very difficult journey for them to get from the ocean into the estuary and all the way up into the small streams where they need to breed. And they invest all of their sort of energetic reserves into that breeding effort, and that's probably one of the reasons that it's not even worth it for them to save anything for another try, and they all die after spawning. But as you can see, there's 2 points in the life cycle where they have to pass through the estuary. So the estuary is really key in the life cycle of these anadromous species. All right, so the opposite life cycle is actually possible. There are some species that they call catadromous, and catadromous species have their babies in the ocean, and the adults live in freshwater. So this is perhaps a less common strategy because typically the ocean is a more dangerous environment for babies. But there are some species that, due to their adaptations or the particular parts of the ocean that they use for spawning and breeding, it works out for them. And so eels in the genus Anguilla, which includes both the American eels and the European eels, they have a catadromous life history strategy with a very, very long migration where their babies are born in deep waters of the mid-Atlantic Ocean, and the adults live in freshwater streams and rivers throughout the coasts of Europe and North America. So the life cycle, the babies are this weird transparent larvae called a leptocephalus larvae. It looks sort of like a glass leaf. And these larvae then transition from their sort of flattened leaf-like form to still mostly transparent but more traditional eel-like form called the glass eel as they move from the open ocean towards the coasts and enter fresh water. And then they become this sort of brownish, typical non-breeding adult eel in the estuaries or freshwaters of the coast until the eel is compelled by instinct to re-enter the ocean and seek out the spawning grounds in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And they undergo this interesting change where their eyes get bigger and they develop a silvery color for camouflage in the deep mesopelagic zone of the ocean as they make their way to the breeding grounds and produce the next generation of leptocephalus larvae. So this life cycle was a mystery to scientists for quite a long period of time, but the mystery of where the breeding grounds of the eels were was discovered by surveys of plankton in the deep sea, which included the eel larvae. And they sort of saw the size of the eel larvae in different zones of the ocean. And they knew that where the larvae were smallest, that was probably where the larvae were being born. And then as where you found the bigger larvae, that's where they were sort of like fanning out back, getting ready to go back into the land to have their adult life cycle. So the area of the mid-Atlantic Ocean in sort of the Sargasso Sea and for the American eel, and then east of Bermuda for the European eel is the epicenter of their breeding grounds, and that's based on the size of their larvae. A more coastal type of catadromous life cycle is exemplified by the blue crabs, which we discussed earlier in the estuarine circulation explanation. But blue crabs, even though they don't go as far into freshwater or as far into the ocean, they do have a catadromous life cycle where they tend to be hanging out in rivers or low salinity portions of estuaries as adults, and then they release their eggs in the open ocean. The larvae develop in the coastal ocean and then make their way back into estuaries as adults. So they're at least sort of catadromous. All right, so one of the ways that we can sort of track these migrations of fishes and other organisms that move into and out of the estuaries at different stages in their life cycles is by examining the chemistry of their otoliths. So an otolith is an ear bone in the fish that is particularly good at sort of growing in layers as the fish ages, and then those layers can be counted to figure out the age of the fish, and the chemistry in the layers can be analyzed to figure out what type of water the fish was in at the ages that it laid down each of those layers of growth of its ear bone. So if you analyze the chemistry of the layers, you can figure out, for example, if the fish was in freshwater or saltwater, and analyzing the chemistry in more complex ways, you can even tell what estuary it was in. So it's sort of a way of sort of reading the past of the fish by analyzing the ear bone. The methods that they use to do this are very high tech. They'll slice the otolith in half so that you can reveal the layers of the different ages of the fish. And then they blast it with a laser that vaporizes the bone into dust, and the dust is sucked into a mass spectrometer. The MS stands for mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer can analyze the elemental makeup of the materials in the bone. And some of the ratios of different elements in the bone of the ear can tell you about the environment that the fish was in. So one of the classic things that's often analyzed is the ratio of strontium to calcium in the fish bone. So in fresh water there's very little strontium, so you have a low strontium to calcium ratio in the bone. If the fish was in fresh water when it laid that piece of bone down, whereas if the fish was in salt water, it has a much higher ratio of strontium, and you would see that. So you could see where the fish was at different phases of its life, whether it was in fresh water, salt water, or in the brackish waters of an estuary. So this is a problem that I will pose for you here. So let's say you look at the fish at different ages, and you can see that it had a low strontium to calcium ratio, and then had higher strontium to calcium ratio, then it had a high strontium to calcium ratio, then a low strontium to calcium ratio again. And so if you looked at this pattern, you'd say, okay, well, the fish as a larvae was in fresh water, and then and then it sort of had this period where it was in the estuary based on this strontium to calcium ratio. Then here it looks like it was in the ocean because he had a high strontium to calcium ratio, but then looks like it was back in fresh water again. So maybe it returned to fresh water for some reason, perhaps to spawn later in its life cycle. So that's the kind of thing that you could learn from analyzing the strontium to calcium signals in the different layers of a fish's otolith. All right, so the final thing that I should say about estuaries is something about the dangers in estuaries. So even though they're wonderful, highly productive environments, there are some dangers to human life in estuaries. So this is a ranger at the Everglades National Park, where there are huge networks of estuaries with mangroves and salt marshes, and there are many types of mosquitoes that breed in this sort of wetland matrix, particularly the salt marsh mosquito, which can breed in salty waters of mangrove swamps and salt marshes. And as soon as the ranger sort of took the net off of his face got covered over with mosquitoes. Another danger in estuaries is this type of biting fly called the greenhead fly, which is abundant in salt marshes of the east coast of the United States. And they can really be maddeningly annoying if you're getting bitten by these greenhead flies when you're trying to study the salt marsh or study the oyster reefs or whatever it is else that's living around there. This is a Florida species of scorpion. So it's a distant relative of spiders that's sometimes found in mangrove swamps and other forests in Florida. So if you're working in the mangroves and you have your hand on a mangrove branch, you might disturb one of these scorpions and get a very painful sting that will swell your hand up, just looking like you blew air into a rubber glove or something, and be very, very painful. They're not deadly, but they're really painful. Another thing that's not deadly but is painful and somewhat scary is the polychaete worm. So there are many species of polychaete worms, and some of them are relatively innocuous, but some species of polychaete worm are able to bite you. So they have what's called an eversible proboscis, which is sort of like a protruding mouth that comes out of their regular mouth. And in some species they have these painful nippers that can actually punch the skin and draw blood, and they'll also make you itch because they have some irritating chemicals in them. So you don't want to get bitten by one of those worms, and so you got to be a little bit careful if you're digging for clams in the mud or picking through oysters that you don't get nipped by one of these polychaete worms. Um, and perhaps the most dangerous organism in the estuary of all is the oyster. So oysters don't chase after you and eat you or anything like that, but the shells grow on top of each other in these clumps, and the edges of the shells are very sharp, sharp as a razor blade, but imagine like a rusty razor blade that's dirty with all kinds of bacteria from the estuary. And if you maybe didn't see these oysters because the tide was covering them and you were paddleboarding through the estuary and you fell off your paddleboard, it would be sort of like falling down onto a bed of razor blades, and you can really get sliced up by accidentally cutting yourself on oysters. So it's important when you're working in the estuary that you have protective footwear and gloves, and that you sort of watch your step and not get cut by oysters. Um, there are some dangerous vertebrates in estuaries as well. So there are some euryhaline species of sharks, particularly the bull shark, also called the Zambezi shark in South Africa because they're abundant in the Zambezi River. But they're able to tolerate any salinity, so they will live and feed in estuaries, and they're aggressive sharks that have been known to attack humans. Um, Crocodiles and alligators will live in estuaries. Alligators are thought of as being freshwater organisms, but they're happy to live and feed in estuaries as long as they have access to fresh water to osmoregulate now and again. Um, they'll sort of make forays into and out of the estuary as needed. Stingrays they don't prey on humans, but they can be dangerous because they have a barb on their tail, a defensive barb, and if you step on or otherwise irritate a stingray, it'll stab you with the barb. And the stingray barb is it's sort of jagged, and it has these teeth in it that will sort of stab into you and not come out easily. And so like you'll get this spine stuck in you and that's really hard to remove, and messes up your flesh. And it's also poisonous, so you're getting this poison leaked into your flesh that can be extremely, extremely painful and make you never want to go in the water again. So probably the deadliest estuarine organisms of all, though, are the microorganisms. So there's sort of a myth that, oh, salt water is good for germs. It kills the germs. You'll be fine. Just if you've got a cut, go in the salt water and it'll be better. But that's actually terrible advice. Do not go in the water if you have an open wound, because there are many types of microbes that can infect the wound, and the microbes can survive just fine in brackish or salt water, as well as in your flesh. You can even acquire methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is one of the deadliest types of bacterial infections that kills people in hospital settings and such. The CA here stands for community acquired, which means that you didn't get this infection from a hospital, you got this from out in the environment somewhere. And as humans take more antibiotics, a lot of antibiotics and antibiotic resistant germs are released into the environment through wastewater and through farm waste, where farm animals are dosed with a lot of antibiotics. That's also kind of a breeding ground for these antibiotic resistant bacteria. So when you get one of these infections now, it can be very hard to treat with antibiotics because we've sort of bred these naturally occurring bacteria in the environment to be resistant to our antibiotics. So here's like a really serious MRSA infection, and sometimes you have to have fingers or hands or arms or legs amputated because of these infections. In fact, my graduate school roommate almost had to have his thumb amputated after an oyster cut got infected with MRSA when he was a graduate student. And final danger to be aware of in estuaries is that you could get stuck in the mud as the at low tide, and then if you're not rescued in time, the rising tide could come and drown you. So that happens to humans as well as animals. In this estuary in England, which is surrounded by a salt marsh, um, there was a cow that got stuck in the mud, but this local rescue crew was able to save the cow. Unfortunately, many humans and animals have succumbed to drowning after being stuck in the mud of estuaries. So please be very careful if you're exploring mud flats at low tide.